To cover 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I want to start down here in verse 29 because it gives us good context for the whole chapter. And this is kind of a longer chapter. Paul says this, "But let me say this, dear brothers and sisters, the time that remains is very short. So from now on, those with wives should not focus only on their marriage. Those who weep or who rejoice or who buy things should not be absorbed by their weeping or their joy or their possessions. And those who use the things of the world should not become attached to them, for this world, as we know it, will soon pass away." So Paul has on his mind sort of the end times. He has on his mind this sense of urgency that Jesus is coming back, and we should live our Christian lives in the context of that reality. Okay, and so with that in mind, let's scroll to the top because Paul is going to give them some instructions on marriage. Now, regarding the questions you asked in your letter. So apparently the Corinthians had written a letter to Paul asking some of these specific questions. And by the time we get to chapter 7, Paul is now ready to address some of the questions in that letter. So he says this, "Yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations. But," he says in verse 2, "because there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband." The implication here is, the time is so short that you really shouldn't even feel compelled to get married because Jesus is coming back. I mean, that's kind of what you'll pick up on as you read this chapter. But he's making a concession saying, because sexual immorality abounds, go ahead and get married. In fact, he says this, "Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy." He's talking about in marriage, "for a limited time so that you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. And afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So you can see Paul gets really practical here in this chapter about marriage and sexuality, and he even gets practical about divorce and separation. And again, I'll let you read all that for yourself. But here's what he says in verse 17, and I think this kind of sums it up. He says, "Each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you in, and remain as you were when God first called you." So, for example, he says, if you're not married, don't rush to get married. If you are married, well, then stay married, right? He says, "This is my rule for all the churches." And then he gives another example. He says, "For instance, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it." That is kind of an uncomfortable thought right there. And he says, "The man who was uncircumcised when he became a believer should not be circumcised now, because there's no need to be." Now, he talks about this more in some of his other letters when he talks about this from a theological perspective, that we're saved by grace through faith. We're not saved by a work. Go back and see Acts chapter 15 and some of his writings in Galatians and Romans. He says this in verse 19, "For it makes no difference whether or not a man has been circumcised. The important thing is to keep God's commandments." So you see what he's saying? The important thing is, in light of our faith, in light of the fact that Jesus is going to come back someday, we should live out our faith earnestly. We should really live to honor God with all of our choices, whether in marriage, whether in, some other religious practice or anything at all. Remember that the gospel sort of sheds light on all of this stuff. And so that is what 1 Corinthians 7 is all about. And again, this is a longer chapter, but I think that will help you to understand it even as you read some of his instruction to the church in Corinth. So you're ready to read chapter 7. We'll see you tomorrow for chapter 8.